The mahogany-paneled courtroom in Hague felt suffocating under the weight of decades of colonial precedent. Judge Thomas adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, his pale fingers drumming against the bench as whispers echoed through the gallery. The morning light filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor, where African delegates sat in uncomfortable silence. Outside the Dutch, autumn wind rattled the glass, but inside the air was thick with anticipation and barely concealed. Hostility, the scent of old leather and legal documents mixed with the tension that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. Judge Thomas had presided over countless cases involving African nations, always with the same patronizing demeanor that his predecessors had perfected. His voice carried the authority of institutions that had never truly recognized African sovereignty, each word carefully measured to remind everyone present of the established order. The colonial portraits hanging behind his bench seemed to nod in approval as he shuffled through papers with deliberate slowness. His reputation for dismissing African leaders' testimonies was well known among international legal circles, a legacy he wore like a badge of honor. The courtroom's architecture itself seemed designed to dwarf those who dared challenge Western narratives. When the heavy oak doors creaked open, Judge Thomas didn't bother looking up from his documents, assuming it was another minor, delegate or translator. The footsteps approaching were measured, confident, carrying a weight that seemed to shift the very atmosphere of the room. Other judges exchanged glances as the gallery fell into an unusual silence, sensing something significant was about to unfold. The morning session had been routine until this moment, filled with procedural arguments and bureaucratic delays typical of international courts. But now, even the stenographer paused, her fingers hovering over the keys as an inexplicable energy filled the space. Thomas finally raised his head, expecting to see a familiar face from the African Union's legal team. Perhaps another lawyer in an expensive suit trying to navigate European legal traditions. Instead, his eyes met those of a young man whose presence commanded immediate attention, whose calm confidence seemed to challenge every assumption the courtroom was built upon. The judge's prepared remarks died in his throat as he realized this wasn't just another diplomatic functionary, but someone whose very presence threatened to upset the carefully maintained balance of power. The silence stretched longer than protocol allowed, broken only by the distant sound of protesters gathering in. The square outside, their chants barely audible through the thick walls. Ibrahim Traoré stepped into the courtroom with the quiet dignity of a man who had faced far greater challenges than judicial intimidation. His military fatigues, simple yet immaculate, stood in stark contrast to the ornate suits and ceremonial robes surrounding him. The red beret of Burkina Faso's revolution sat firmly on his head, a symbol that had not graced these halls since Thomas Sankoura's era. His dark eyes surveyed the room with the calm assessment of a leader who understood that this moment would define more than just legal proceedings. The gallery of African delegates straightened in their seats, recognizing the significance of his unexpected presence. Behind him, two modest advisors carried briefcases that seemed to contain the hopes of an entire continent. The whispers began immediately, rippling through the courtroom like wildfire as diplomats and journalists tried to process what they were witnessing. Judge Thomas's carefully planned session had just become something entirely different, something that would be remembered long after the legal precedents were forgotten. Ibrahim's footsteps echoed with purpose as he approached the designated area, his movement fluid and unhurried despite the weight of the moment. The European observers shifted uncomfortably, their confidence shaken by the presence of a leader who had already proven that African youth could reshape their destiny. Even the court reporters leaned forward, sensing that history was about to unfold before their eyes. The autumn light seemed to brighten as it fell across his shoulders, as if the very elements recognized the gravity of his arrival. "Your Honor," Ibrahim began, his voice carrying the strength of the Sahel winds and the wisdom of ancient kingdoms. His English was precise, deliberate, carrying the weight of millions who had never been heard in these halls of international justice. Judge Thomas opened his mouth to interrupt, but something in the young president's bearing gave him pause. The courtroom fell silent except for the soft scratching of pens as journalists scrambled to capture every word. Ibrahim's presence seemed to expand beyond his physical form, filling the space with an energy that made the colonial portraits appear suddenly outdated. This was not just a man speaking, but the voice of a generation that refused to accept the limitations imposed by history. The African delegates in the gallery began to sit taller, their earlier resignation replaced by something approaching hope. Ibrahim's advisors placed their briefcases on the table with quiet confidence, the sound echoing through the hushed courtroom like a declaration of intent. Judge Thomas found himself leaning forward despite his efforts to maintain judicial detachment, drawn by a charisma that transcended traditional diplomatic protocol. The young president's calm demeanor suggested he had come prepared for whatever resistance he might encounter. Outside the protesters, chants grew louder, as if they could sense through the thick walls that their champion had arrived. The very foundations of the court seemed to shift as two worldviews prepared to collide. Judge Thomas's composure cracked like thin ice under pressure as Ibrahim's presence continued to command the courtroom's attention. His face flushed red beneath his powdered wig, the veins in his neck becoming visible as he struggled to reassert his authority. The gavel trembled in his grip before he brought it down with unnecessary force, the sharp crack echoing through the silent hall. "This is highly irregular," he declared, his voice pitched higher than usual, betraying the panic beneath his judicial mask. The other judges exchanged uncertain glances, unsure whether to support their colleagues' obvious discomfort or maintain professional neutrality. Ibrahim remained motionless, his steady gaze never wavering from Thomas's increasingly agitated face. "Security." Judge Thomas's voice cracked as he called out, his finger pointing dramatically toward Ibrahim with theatrical outrage. The word hung in the air like a colonial command, heavy with centuries of institutional racism disguised as legal procedure. Court security officers hesitated at their posts, their training conflicting with their instincts as they witnessed something unprecedented unfolding. The gallery erupted in shocked murmurs as African delegates rose to their feet in solidarity, their voices creating a low rumble of disapproval. Ibrahim's advisors stepped closer to their leader, forming a protective barrier without creating confrontation. The morning light, streaming through the windows, seemed to spotlight the moral divide, splitting the courtroom in two. "Remove this man immediately," Thomas shouted, his judicial decorum completely abandoned as spittle flew from his lips. The security guards moved forward reluctantly, their heavy boots echoing against the marble floor like a funeral march. Ibrahim raised his hand slightly, a gesture so subtle yet powerful that it stopped the advancing officer's mid-step. His calm smile never faltered as he reached into his jacket pocket, causing a collective intake of breath throughout the courtroom. Judge Thomas gripped his bench until his knuckles turned white, his eyes wide with fear that had nothing to do with physical threat. The tension reached a breaking point as everyone waited to see how this unprecedented confrontation would resolve. The head of security, a grizzled veteran named Captain Mueller, approached Ibrahim with visible reluctance in his weathered face. His years of service had taught him to recognize true leadership, and something about the young president's bearing gave him pause. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave," he said quietly, his voice lacking the authority his position demanded. Ibrahim nodded respectfully to the captain, understanding the man's difficult position while never breaking eye contact with Judge Thomas. The courtroom held its breath as protocols clashed with principles, and the weight of history pressed down on everyone present. Outside, the protesters' chants grew louder, as if sensing their leader moment of trial through the ancient stones. Ibrahim's hand emerged from his jacket holding not a weapon, but a weathered leather document folder that seemed to carry the weight of generations. His movement was deliberate and graceful, like a master chess player, revealing his decisive move after careful consideration. The security officers froze mid-step, their confusion evident as they realized their assumptions had been completely wrong. Judge Thomas's face went pale as he watched Ibrahim unfold papers with the reverence of a man handling sacred texts. The courtroom's tension transformed from fear to anticipation as if everyone sensed they were witnessing a pivotal moment in history. Ibrahim's calm smile widened slightly, revealing a confidence that came not from arrogance, but from absolute certainty in his cause. Your Honor, Ibrahim began, his voice resonating through the hall with the clarity of mountain streams and the power of ancient wisdom. Each word was chosen with surgical precision, delivered with the respect due to the office, while acknowledging none to the man who currently occupied it. His accent carried the music of his homeland, transforming the sterile courtroom into a space where African voices finally had equal standing. Captain Muller stepped back instinctively, recognizing that he was witnessing something far beyond his security protocols. The other judges leaned forward despite themselves drawn by a presence that seemed to make the very air shimmer with possibility. Even the stenographer paused, her fingers hovering over the keys as she absorbed the gravity of the moment. I come before this court not as a supplicant seeking your permission, but as elected representative of a sovereign people demanding justice. Ibrahim's words cut through decades of diplomatic doublespeak like a sword through silk, each syllable delivered with unwavering conviction. Judge Thomas opened his mouth to interrupt, but found himself silenced by the moral authority radiating from the young president. The African delegates in the gallery sat transfixed, many wiping tears from their eyes as they heard their struggles finally articulated with such eloquence. The European observers shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware that their comfortable assumptions were being systematically dismantled. Ibrahim's advisors watched with quiet pride as their leader transformed the courtroom from a place of judgment into a forum for truth. The folder in Ibrahim's hands seemed to pulse with energy as he prepared to reveal its contents to the stunned assembly. His eyes never left Judge Thomas's face, reading the fear and recognition dawning there like sunrise over savannah. Before you, order my removal. Your Honor, perhaps you should examine what I have brought for this court's consideration. The challenge hung in the air like lightning before thunder, promising revelations that would shake the very foundations of international justice. Captain Mueller took another step back, his hand moving away from his radio as he realized this was beyond any security protocol. The moment stretched like a held breath, with the entire courtroom waiting to see how Judge Thomas would respond to this unprecedented challenge to his authority. Ibrahim's fingers traced the edges of a yellow document as he lifted it from a leather folder with ceremonial reverence. The paper bore official seals and signatures that seemed to glow under the courtroom's harsh fluorescent lights, each mark a testament to promises made and deliberately forgotten. Judge Thomas's eyes widened in recognition, his face draining of color as memory crashed over him like a cold wave from the North Sea. The document's corners were worn from handling, suggesting it had been treasured and protected through decades of neglect by those who signed it. African delegates craned their necks to see what could cause such a dramatic shift in the judge's demeanor. The silence in the courtroom was so complete that the rustle of the ancient papers sounded like thunder. This, Your Honor, is the 1974 Agreement on African judicial sovereignty signed by your predecessor, Judge Harrison, and witnessed by 17 African nations. Ibrahim's voice carried the weight of historical vindication as he held the document aloft for all to see. The treaty had been buried in bureaucratic archives for 50 years, its existence conveniently forgotten when its provisions became inconvenient for Western interests. Judge Thomas's hands trembled as recognition dawned. His own signature appeared as a junior clerk who had witnessed the historic agreement. The other judges exchanged alarmed glances, suddenly aware that their authority in African matters was about to be fundamentally challenged. Captain Mel stepped closer, not to arrest, but to protect what might be the most important document in the room's history. The gallery erupted in whispers as African delegates recognized the implications of this forgotten treaty, their excitement building like a gathering storm. Ibrahim continued with surgical precision, his voice never wavering despite the magnitude of the moment unfolding. Article 7 specifically grants African heads of state the right to address this court without prior permission or procedural barriers. Judge Thomas's breathing became labored as the full weight of his earlier actions settled upon him like a crushing burden. The document seemed to expand in Ibrahim's hands, its legal power filling the space with an energy that made the colonial portraits appear suddenly obsolete. Even the court reporters leaned forward, sensing that legal history was being rewritten before their eyes. Judge Thomas reached for his water, glass with shaking hands, his mouth suddenly dry as the Sahara winds. The implications cascaded through his mind like falling dominoes. Every dismissal, every condescending ruling, every time he had silenced African voices suddenly, took on new legal significance. Ibrahim's advisors watched with quiet satisfaction as decades of careful research and preparation reached their decisive moment. The forgotten promise was no longer forgotten, and its resurrection threatened to transform international justice forever. Outside, the protesters' chants seemed to harmonize with the courtroom's electric atmosphere, as if the very stones of the Hague were awakening to a new reality. The document in Ibrahim's hands had become more than paper. It was a key unlocking doors that had been sealed for generations. Judge Thomas's trembling hands betrayed memories he had spent decades trying to bury. His prestigious career built upon foundations he now prayed would remain hidden. As a young law student in the 1980s, he had written his doctoral thesis on modernizing African legal systems, a euphemistic title for dismantling traditional justice structures. His father, Colonel James Thomas, had commanded mining operations in Burkina Faso during the final years of French colonial rule, enriching European corporations while impoverishing local communities. The family fortune that funded Thomas's education at Cambridge came directly from uranium extracted from the very soil Ibrahim now defended. His rise through the judicial ranks had been meteoric, aided by connections forged in the shadows of colonial exploitation. The irony was not lost on him that the grandson of those he had helped dispossess now stood before his bench demanding justice. Ibrahim's steady gaze seemed to peer through Thomas's judicial robes into his soul, as if the young president could see every compromise and moral failure that had brought them to this moment, the forgotten treaty in Ibrahim's hands represented more than legal precedent. It was evidence of a system designed to fail, crafted by men like Thomas's mentors, who never intended to honor their commitments to African sovereignty. Thomas remembered the private dinners were his father's. Friends had laughed about the naive Africans who believed European promises of partnership and equality. His own signature on witness documents had been more than bureaucratic procedure. It had been participation in a grand deception, spanning generations. The weight of inherited guilt pressed down on him like the tropical heat his father had described in letters home. Now, 50 years later, the bill for that deception had come due. The other judges watched their colleagues' deterioration with growing concern, unaware of the personal history unraveling behind his increasingly frantic demeanor. Thomas's breathing grew shallow as flashes of his father's mining camp flickered through his memory. The armed guards, the environmental devastation, the families displaced without compensation. His judicial career had been an unconscious attempt to legitimize his family's legacy, convincing himself that European legal systems could bring order to African chaos. But Ibrahim's presence shattered that comfortable fiction, revealing it as nothing more than sophisticated racism dressed in judicial robes. The young president's calm confidence reminded Thomas of the village elders his father had dismissed as primitive, their dignity intact, despite systematic humiliation. The courtroom felt smaller now, as if the walls were closing on decades of carefully constructed lies. Ibrahim seemed to sense the judge's internal struggle, his expression softening with something approaching compassion for a man trapped by his own history. The document in his hands contained not just legal provisions, but the hopes of communities Thomas's family had helped destroy, their voices echoing across generations through yellowed paper and faded ink. Thomas realized that his Father's stories of civilizing missions have been nothing more than bedtime tales, told by a man who needed to sleep despite his crimes. The mining concessions, the displaced villages, the environmental poisoning, all had been justified by the same legal frameworks. Thomas now represented. His family's wealth had been built on the systematic theft Ibrahim now sought to address. Through proper channels, the circle was closing, and there was nowhere left to run from the truth that had always been, waiting in the shadows. The ancient cobblestones of the Hague's Justice Square trembled beneath the feet of thousands as word spread through social media that their president faced confrontation inside. Young Burkina-based students studying in European universities abandoned their classes, their textbooks forgotten as they rushed to witness history unfolding. Elderly immigrants who had worked in Dutch factories for decades emerged from their modest apartments, their weathered faces glowing with pride they had rarely been allowed to express. The crowd grew, organically, fed by WhatsApp messages and live streams showing Ibrahim standing firm against judicial intimidation. Drums appeared as if conjured from the air, their rhythms echoing off the sterile government buildings like ancestral voices, refusing to be silenced. The morning drizzle that had dampened the square earlier seemed to evaporate under the collective heat of their righteous anger. Dutch police formed nervous barriers around the courthouse, their training inadequate for a crowd united not by violence but by hope. The protesters sang traditional songs that had sustained their grandparents through Colonial, oppression their voices harmonizing across ethnic and linguistic lines. Children born in European cities stood beside their immigrant parents finally, understanding why their families had carried such quiet pain for so many years. Smartphones captured every moment, broadcasting the awakening to homes in Ouagadougou, Bobo Dioulasso, and villages across the Sahel, where people gathered around shared screens. The crowd's energy was infectious, drawing curious onlookers who gradually transformed from observers to supporters. As they witnessed authentic dignity in action, even hardened European journalists found themselves moved by the raw emotion rippling through the square like waves across ancient lakes. Inside nearby cafes, African diplomats abandoned their careful neutrality as they watched their people finally finding their collective voice. The chants shifted from Murray to French to English, ensuring their message reached every corner of the international community. Thomas Sankar's Dream Lives echoed across the square, connecting Ibrahim's struggle to the martyred revolutionary who had dared to challenge Western exploitation decades earlier. Young women raised portraits of Burkina, Faso's fallen heroes, their faces shining with tears of joy as they realized the revolution had not died. With its founders, the crowd swayed like grain in the wind, individual voices, merging into something larger than themselves, more powerful than any security force could contain. Their presence outside the courthouse became a prayer made manifest, amplifying Ibrahim's voice inside the halls of power. The European authorities watched nervously from their windows as the square filled beyond their crowd control. Estimates, this peaceful uprising revealing the depth of African frustration with international injustice. Police radios crackled with reports of similar gatherings forming outside African embassies across the continent, solidarity spreading like wildfire across time zones. The protesters' disciplined organization impressed even skeptical observers, their unity born from decades of shared struggle and collective hope. Social media algorithms carried their voices across the globe, breaking through the usual filters that buried African stories beneath Western narratives. Inside the courthouse, the sound of their songs seeped through stone walls and bulletproof glass, reaching Ibrahim's ears like a choir of angels. The community had awakened, and no amount of institutional power could force them back to sleep. The heavy courthouse doors opened with a resonant creak as an unexpected figure entered the charged atmosphere. Mama Aminata, an 89-year-old woman whose presence commanded immediate reverence. Her traditional indigo blue flowed like water as she moved with surprising grace, her walking stick tapping against the marble floor in a rhythm that seemed to echo through generations. The security guard stepped aside instinctively, recognizing something sacred in her weathered dignity that transcended their protocols. Her eyes, clouded with age, but burning with purpose, found Ibrahim across the crowded courtroom, and a smile of profound recognition passed between them. Judge Thomas felt his breath catch as he realized this was no ordinary observer, but someone whose very existence challenged everything he represented. The African delegates rose to their feet in spontaneous respect, understanding that a living witness to history had entered their midst. Mama Aminata's voice, when she spoke, carried the weight of 8 decades spent watching her homeland systematic exploitation by foreign powers. "I was there when they signed your papers," she said, her words cutting to the courtroom's tension like morning light through darkness. Her French was precise. Despite her advanced age, each syllable delivered with the authority of someone who had survived colonialism, independence, coups, and countless broken promises. Judge Thomas's hands trembled as recognition dawned. This woman had been present at the original treaty, signing, a young mother then now, an elder, bearing witness to its resurrection. Her testimony threatened to transform abstract legal arguments into personal accountability for decades of institutional betrayal. The stenographers' fingers moved frantically, understanding that these words would echo through legal history. "Long after the session ended, your father promised my village clean water when his machines poisoned our wells." Mama Aminata continued, her gaze fixed on Judge Thomas with laser intensity. The courtroom fell silent, except for the soft weeping of African delegates who recognized their own family stories in her words. Her voice never wavered, despite the emotional weight of memory spanning nearly a century of struggle against foreign exploitation. Judge Thomas's face crumbled as the abstract became personal. His family's crimes, given human form in this woman's unwavering testimony. The other judges shifted uncomfortably, realizing that their colleagues' composure was disintegrating under the weight of historical truth. Even Captain Mueller found himself wiping tears from his eyes, moved by dignity that transcended every barrier of race, nationality, and language. Ibrahim watched with quiet pride as Mama Aminata transformed the sterile courtroom into a space where truth could finally be spoken without fear. Her presence validated everything he had risked by coming here, proving that the struggle for African dignity connected generations across time and space. The forgotten treaty in his hands suddenly felt lighter, supported by the testimony of someone who had lived through its betrayal and survived to witness its resurrection. Judge Thomas's professional mask finally shattered, completely, as he faced not just legal precedent, but moral reckoning personified in this remarkable woman's courage. The courtroom had become something unprecedented, a place where power answered the truth rather than the other way around. Outside the crowds, chants seemed to harmonize with Mama Aminata's words, creating a symphony of justice that would resonate long after the session ended. Judge Thomas's world collapsed inward as Mama Aminata's testimony stripped away decades of carefully constructed justifications, leaving him naked before the truth of his family's legacy. His hands shook uncontrollably as he reached for documents that suddenly felt meaningless, the weight of institutional authority evaporating like morning mist. The gavel that had once symbolized his power now seemed like a child's toy, inadequate to silence the voices of those his family had wronged. His breathing became labored as the full scope of his complicity crashed over him. Every dismissed case, every condescending ruling had been part of a system designed to perpetuate the exploitation his father had begun. The other judges watched in alarm as their colleague's professional composure disintegrated before their eyes, his prestigious career crumbling like ancient papyrus exposed to sunlight. The colonial portraits behind his bench seemed to mock him now, their painted eyes reflecting his own moral bankruptcy, back at him with cruel precision. The courtroom's atmosphere shifted palpably, as power dynamics reversed before everyone's eyes, the hunter becoming the hunted in this theater of justice. Ibrahim remained perfectly still, allowing the moment to unfold naturally as truth revealed itself without need for dramatic flourish. Judge Thomas's voice cracked when he tried to speak, his throat constricted by emotions he had suppressed for decades. The African delegates leaned forward collectively, sensing that something unprecedented was happening, a moment when the machinery of international law might actually serve justice rather than power. Mama Aminata's steady gaze never wavered from Thomas's face, her silence more powerful than any accusation. The very air seemed to vibrate with the energy of historical forces realigning themselves around this singular moment of moral reckoning. I remember the letters, Thomas whispered, his admission barely audible above the courtroom's electric tension. His father's correspondence from the mining camps had described African resistance as primitive superstition, but standing before Ibrahim and Mama Aminata, he finally understood it as legitimate rage against systematic theft. The weight of inherited guilt crushed down upon him as he realized that his entire judicial career had been an unconscious attempt to legitimize crimes that could never be justified. His prestigious education, his rapid promotion through the ranks, even his appointment to this court, all had been purchased with uranium stolen from the very people now demanding justice. The other judges exchanged alarmed glances, recognizing that their colleague was experiencing a complete psychological breakdown under the pressure of moral truth. Captain Mueller stepped forward instinctively, not to arrest anyone, but to provide support for a man whose world was dissolving before their eyes. Ibrahim's expression softened slightly as he witnessed Thomas's internal collapse, understanding that sometimes the oppressor becomes as trapped by the system as the oppressed. The forgotten treaty in his hands represented more than legal precedent. It was a bridge between past injustices and future redemption, offering hope even for those who had perpetuated harm. Thomas looked up at Ibrahim with eyes full of desperate recognition, seeing in the young president the dignity his father had taught him to despise. The courtroom held its breath as Eve realized they were witnessing not just a legal proceeding, but a moment of profound human transformation. Outside, the crowd's chant seemed to quiet, as if sensing through the ancient stones that something sacred was occurring within. The tables had turned completely, and the machinery of justice was finally serving its intended purpose. Ibrahim rose from his seat with the fluid grace of a man who had always known this moment would come. His movement, transforming the courtroom into a cathedral of justice. The forgotten treaty remained in his hands, but now it seemed less like a legal document and more like a sacred scroll connecting past struggles to future possibilities. His eyes swept across the assembled crowd, judges, delegates, security, officers, journalists, seeing not adversaries, but fellow human beings trapped in systems that diminished everyone's humanity. Judge Thomas looked up at him with a mixture of fear and desperate hope, finally understanding that redemption might be possible even for those who had inherited guilt. The African delegates held their breath, knowing that whatever their president said next would echo through generations yet unborn. Outside, the crowd's energy seemed to pulse through the courthouse walls, amplifying Ibrahim's presence until he appeared larger than life itself. Your Honor, I did not come here today to humiliate you or to seek revenge for crimes of the past. Ibrahim began, his voice carrying the gentle strength of rivers that carved canyons through patience rather than force. His words flowed with the wisdom of ancestors who had survived slavery, colonialism, and exploitation while maintaining their fundamental humanity intact. Judge Thomas wiped tears from his eyes as he realized that the young man before him was offering grace where condemnation would have been justified. The other judges leaned forward despite themselves, drawn by a moral authority that transcended every law they had studied in their prestigious universities. Ibrahim's advisors watched with quiet pride as their leader transformed legal proceedings into something approaching spiritual healing. Even the stenographer paused in her typing, understanding that some words were too sacred to be reduced to mere transcription. I came to remind this court that justice is not about punishment, but about restoration, restoring dignity to those who have been stripped of it, restoring balance to relationships that have been distorted by power. Ibrahim's message resonated through the courtroom like church bells calling the faithful to prayer. each word carefully chosen to heal rather than wound. Judge Thomas nodded through his tears, finally understanding that the young president was offering him a path toward redemption that his own legal training had never contemplated. The forgotten treaty became a symbol not of past betrayals, but of future possibilities, proof that Africans had always been willing to work within international systems when those systems honored their basic humanity. Mama Aminata smiled from the gallery, her weathered face glowing with the satisfaction of someone who had lived long enough to see justice finally served. The courtroom's atmosphere shifted from confrontation to communion as Ibrahim's words broke down barriers that had seemed insurmountable moments before. The young president's final words hung in the air like stars, appearing at twilight, illuminating truths that had always been present but rarely acknowledged. We are all children of the same earth, breathing the same air, sharing the same hopes for our children's future, he concluded, his voice soft but unwavering in its conviction. Judge Thomas stood slowly, his judicial robes feeling suddenly insignificant compared to moral authority radiating from the man he had tried to remove from his courtroom. The security officers stepped back, respectfully, understanding that they were witnesses to something far greater than legal procedure. Ibrahim's message had transformed everything: the courtroom, the proceedings, and most importantly, the hearts of everyone present. Outside, the crowd erupted in celebration as news of the transformation spread through social media, their joy carrying across continents to villages where children would learn that dignity once lost could indeed be reclaimed. Ibrahim Traoré's courage in that courtroom proved that dignity cannot be silenced by intimidation. When African leaders stand firm, even the most powerful institutions must face the truth. What do you think about Ibrahim's powerful message?